So welcome to our session. We're still waiting for Jonas, one of our panelists, but hopefully he will join us in a few minutes. Welcome to our session. It's called Police Resilience and Mental Health. My name is Teun Pieter. I have a background in neurobiology, and I'm currently working as PhD candidate at the Dutch Police Academy. We would like to have an interactive session, so please use the chat function. We can talk to each other. So share your comments and your questions. So today we have a panel of 3 researchers, hopefully Jonas from Sweden, Paula from Canada, and Annika from the Netherlands. Jonas is an experienced police officer. He knows what police officers need. Paula is an experienced researcher, and she will share interesting insights with us. And Annika is scientific chair at the Dutch Police Academy, and she will share her thoughts about the next steps in exploring resilience, and of course, in the context of police work. Paula, I think it's better that you are the first speaker, but before I introduce you, I would like you to introduce 2 friends of mine. Here they are. Hello. So this is Beth. She's a police officer, and this is Ben, also a police officer. And they are working as police officers. Every day is a lot of work and a lot of fun. Sometimes the days are boring, but most of the time they had to survive critical incident after critical incident. So let's start with Beth. On the first side, she's happy, but I will tell you a secret. Mentally, she's retired. She derives no meaning from her work, and Beth experienced no connection with her colleagues and the police organization. Basically, her passion is gone. And this is Ben. He developed psychosocial complaints, and after years, he got a label, the PTSD label. However, he sees himself as recovered. He enjoys his life, his work, his family. So, when you met Ben and Beth, what would you say? Do you have any advice? Who is resilient and who is recovered? So, this is an example to explain resilience is a complex topic. And well, we don't fear complexity, of course. So let's go to Canada to explore the resilience of police officers. Paula, will you start your presentation?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. Thank you again, everybody, for joining me. I hope to share the right screen here. Let's see. I believe. Or do you see my presenter? No, I think you see my presenter view. Hold on, I want to give. Sorry, the right one. So can everyone see the title slide? Maybe Teun Pieter, I don't know, let me know.
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Not the presenter view, right, Marcia?
We can see. Go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, thank you again, everybody, for your attention and for joining us today. So I'm speaking on behalf of Dr. Greg Anderson, who's my former postdoctoral advisor at the Justice Institute of British Columbia, but we are now both in other parts of Canada. I'm from Toronto. And we're speaking to you today on kind of defining resilience. So thank you for letting me start off, Teun Pieter. So as you mentioned with Beth and Ben, your friends and examples there, that the idea of resilience is quite broad and can lead to different characterization of who is and who isn't a resilient person. So on the slide here, we can see examples of real and fictitious persons that have characteristics of resiliency, although their path to acquiring this label can often be quite different. So what's common among these examples is that the subject has had to meet and overcome one or more life challenges, be it political, social, spiritual, or physical. And though this may be similar to the types of events that first responders like police will encounter, these certainly don't encompass everything. Another facet of resiliency is the idea that resilient people bounce back or are capable of withstanding the distress and dysfunction associated with stress, loss, and trauma. The thing is, it's oftentimes a traumatic incident may make it impossible to return to the original state. And we also have yet to understand why two individuals like friends Beth and Ben might be exposed to the same stressor, and one develops a psychological injury while the other is able to rise above or reestablish equilibrium or emotional and mental balance. And furthermore, resilient persons, they'll continue to face the same stressors as everyone else, as well as the resulting physical and mental effects. But what sets them apart is that they've learned how to deal with these inevitable stressors over their life course and continue to function in spite of them. Resilience can be broken down then to three stages. Resistance can be understood as the innate shield that protects us from psychosocial stressors and the capacity for successful adaptation. Recovery is similar to the concept of bouncing back to a previous state of well-being following a stressful exposure. And finally, reconfiguration is the capacity to rebound with new skills and strengths that would not have developed if not for the adversity. So despite the negative consequences of trauma, resilience reflects a capacity to grow and develop or harness skills that you already had that serve a psychologically protective function. As I've already shared, there are many ways to define the concept of resiliency, and the definition that we've chosen for this presentation, as well as for our current long-term project that Greg was funded by the Canadian Institutes for Health Research, is the ability to engage in adaptive behaviors in the face of stress and adversity. And this definition and many others touch upon several key factors, such as adaptation, balance, determinism, competence, optimism, as well as acceptance. And some of these factors include physiological and behavioral responses as well. So with these in mind, we can begin to list or describe what are the qualities of resilience, much like I did using the individuals in the first slide. So for example, some qualities of resilience relate back to one's social connections and the ability to engage with family and colleagues and friends in times of need rather than isolating or withdrawing. So Greg's Resilience Project has also identified 3 pillars of resilience that, much like a stool, you require all 3 of these pillars in order to support an individual and foster what we call an ecosystem of resilience. So many approaches tend to focus on just one of these pillars, whether it be the individual, their community or organizational culture, or their families. Each of the 3 pillars of resilience can further be broken down to include specific facets, such as individual coping skills and self-regulation skills, as well as efforts within an organization, like a police organization, to promote a positive and meaningful workplace culture. And despite being the greatest source of support, there's relatively less research on how to support families that themselves support loved ones exposed to occupational stressors, and how they can foster individual and collective resilience. And given that training and education is a facet in each of the 3 pillars, we wanted to see what existing research evidence says works before developing effective tools to support resilience in each of the 3 pillars, which is the ultimate goal of Greg's longitudinal project. So to answer this question, we've taken a systematic approach and focused on literature searches that examines the effectiveness of organizational training programs and interventions that focus on the individual and which seek to promote resilience through reducing post-traumatic stress injuries. So I think we're all familiar with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, but these injuries are defined as increased symptoms of mental disorders like PTSD, as well as depression, anxiety, as well as other psychological symptoms like burnout and general stress and well-being. By identifying intervention or educational training approaches that effectively build resilience, coping, and wellness capacity, we can also reveal some of the underlying mechanisms of how these processes work to influence health and performance. So I'll share with you the results of 2 of 4 systematic reviews we conducted. So we read lots of research papers. And the first one examined the existing literature on prevention programs. So these are very broadly defined. that all sought to mitigate the psychological impact of potentially traumatic exposures. So this includes any kind of program or intervention that sought to reduce PTSI following a work-related exposure. In order to cast the broadest net to find out what actually works, we included any studies that looked at police as well as other public safety personnel. So these are first responders like firefighters, paramedics, as well as correctional officers, dispatchers, and so on, as well as frontline healthcare workers like nurses, doctors, and staff in emergency or trauma centers, which are an especially relevant population to consider now in light of COVID-19. I'll talk a little bit about our COVID research as well. Our review identified several educational training and intervention categories that were also very broadly defined and which either explicitly focused on resilience promotion or related topics, including effective coping skill building, stress management, emotion regulation for work-related stressors. Our results showed a very significant variety in the manner in which these programs are delivered. So from multimodal or blended approaches that combine some of the topics that I just mentioned, and these blended multimodal programs appear to be the most effective in reducing PTSI symptoms relative to other delivery modes like pure psychoeducation. So that's just kind of group lecture-based sessions or individual online learning modules, mindfulness-based practices. And we also found a growing number of recent studies that use objective biofeedback of physiological stress signals like heart rate variability to condition adaptive breathing and coping skills. The second review that we conducted looked at changes in adaptive coping skills and strategies, such as seeking social support or engaging in productive behaviors like leisure. And we also wanted to see studies measured decreases to maladaptive or avoidant coping strategies like substance abuse, avoidance, and withdrawal, which can exacerbate PTSIs. And what we found in both of these systematic reviews and meta-analyses that across all of the studies and training approaches that we reviewed, that there's a lack of highly significant changes to either PTSI or coping, and they're not sustained over the long term. And we can attribute this lack of the strength of evidence to a lack of high quality research studies that vary greatly in how these programs are delivered at different organizations, including their content, their duration, how long they were offered, as well as inconsistent timing for follow-up evaluations and different aspects of doing a research study within an operating organization. Another significant problem was comparing outcomes across studies, which use numerous different measures from validated questionnaires to non-standard self-reported questions about past or current levels of stress or functioning. And this varied operationalization of resilience becomes a significant measurement issue. So what is the unit of analysis for measuring or quantifying resilience overall for each of the three pillars of resilience and at each stage of resilience that we defined earlier? So these are just some of the methodological problems that researchers like myself will need to work together with expert clinicians, as well as practitioners, to ensure that these measures translate to indicators that make sense in a real world context. So very quickly, I don't want to take up too much time, but I'll get into some of the insights developed from our investigations of COVID. So based on a preliminary survey that we've handed out, we know that it's significantly impacting all areas of life for police and public safety personnel, including increased concern for their own exposure, spreading it to their family as a function of their work, as well as to their partners and members of the public. Following physical distancing measures and following self-isolation with any kinds of symptoms also makes managing work and life responsibilities much harder. And to further exacerbate these stress-related impacts, many of the adaptive coping strategies that police and others would employ are no longer accessible or significantly interrupted or modified. So these include, sports and fitness facilities, social events, things that may have already been paid for, like weddings and vacations, causing financial strain. However, there are still ways to enjoy nature and be safe. And here's a photo of Greg on my very first day of working with him. He took me, a city girl from Toronto, on a very ambitious hike through the foothills of the beautiful Rocky Mountains. But It was very, very energizing, and through the research that I've just shared with you, and what we hope to continue to do is to energize and support those who protect and serve us by identifying effective evidence-based practices to foster an ecosystem of resilience for police and other first responders. So with that, I thank you all for your attention. Just want to acknowledge our institutional and financial supports and turn back to Toon Peter to kind of help us moderate.
Yes, thank you, Paula. I think there are a lot of questions, but let's first go to Annika so she can give her presentation. Jonas is still, I texted him, but he's not here. But Annika, would like to give you the floor. And I think you need also a presentation.
Yes, thank you very much, Peter. Yeah, because I'm working with a different laptop now. There were some problems. Maybe Jonas has the same problems that I experienced just yet. Would be nice. Yeah, thanks. Could you go to presentation mode? Yeah, thanks. The next slide, please. What I would like to do is share with you some thoughts that I've been having on resilience, and Paula just told us much more about the complexity of resilience and how it can be defined. What I will show you is, I will just briefly show you a couple of research projects. I will not go into detail of them, but just to show you what different types of research that we've been doing in the last decade within the Dutch police force. Then I will go into a bit more detail when it comes to the distinction between resilient and vulnerable. And I will end by making some highlights and turning to the mechanism of homeostasis, which I found to be very interesting in using while connecting different types of research on resilience. Well, first of all, what was our working definition in resilience? We used the term performing successfully in critical circumstances. But what we saw in different types of research is that for each and every study, we needed to explicitly explain what performing meant in this type of situation within the police context and what success really meant. So we had to define performing and success, but in each and every study, this is exactly what we did. So we were looking for what is the performance in this context of police, when is it successful, and what exactly are the critical circumstances. So these are the studies that we've been doing. We had a focus on both job performance and on health and well-being. So we had both things in our minds, and we also made explicit what it meant. So that's just to let you know what we focus on. And what we saw was, depending on the study that we performed, these could be very, very different. Like making a good report or communicating with someone else, it depended really on the context. And we did lots of different types of research, for instance, on job performance, resilience training, effect studies, for example, but also on health and well-being, like PTSD studies, and on group dynamics, debriefing, dilemma focus groups, etc., but also on integrity. And what was very difficult is that sometimes the focus is on biological processes, sometimes it's on psychological processes or on moral processes, sometimes it's a person or persons that we studied, sometimes it's groups, sometimes it was the complete organization. So it was really difficult to pinpoint what they really had to in common, these studies. So what exactly do we need in order to integrate or connect all these different types of research results? The next slide, please. And what we really found to be lacking was an underlying mechanism. And I tried to search for it and came across a mechanism which has to do with my own study, which I'm, well, the scientific field that I'm from, because I'm a psychophysiologist. And I was familiar with the mechanism of homeostasis, which is usually used only in biological research. But it's really about an entity and looking what the function or the purpose of an entity is. And the entity in homeostasis is always in open exchange or semi-open exchange with its environment. And the key in homeostasis is that you have to have a look at the purpose and then see how the entity interacts with the dynamic context in order to remain or maintain this function. And you can only understand why a nerve cell does what it does if you know what the purpose within its context is. And that was exactly what we saw in the studies that we did within the police force, that our search for what the success and the performing really was about was the search for the function. And sometimes it said something about the person involved, but sometimes it said not what the person was, but the group or the whole system, the whole organization. And sometimes it was only part of what the person in the context was trying to achieve. So what we found was that homeostasis, no matter if the research was on cells or organs or people or the organization, we could always use the mechanism of homeostasis. And it also made very clear to us that we needed to understand on which level of abstraction we were doing our research. If the level is cells, then we should not say directly something about the person or because it's not the immediate context. The immediate context of the cell is the organ or tissue, and it's not the organism. Maybe you can go to the next slide, please. So what we did was consider the levels of abstraction, mind these different levels. And then you see that you're not always talking about categorical differences between people, the resilient or the vulnerable, but really you're talking about processes that might take place within a person. But even it might be at the same time that a person is both resilient and vulnerable at the same time. It might, but we're looking into this. So we're doing our studies to compare people with themselves, and I'll come back to that in just a minute. What we also found was that you have to consider the context, which Paula also pointed out. If you do not understand the context, you do not understand what the behavior really means. And you have to go up a level and down a level. If you look at an organ, then you have to go down a level to look at the cells. What is it composed of, this organ? And also, what is its purpose up one level, for instance, in an organism? So you have to consider these different levels of abstraction. And the last slide, please. And this really leads us to, I think, uncharted territory, because what is, well, I haven't really seen it in scientific research, that a person is compared with him or herself over a very long period of time. For instance, on varying abstraction levels, like on cells or organs or personal level, or over time, or in different environments, or maybe in different exchange modes within the environments. And this, I think, is really necessary in order to nuance the categorical differences between the resilient and the vulnerable. And this is really our setup for the coming years in different projects that we're running. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Annika, for your presentation. Marcia, are there questions in the chat function?
No, there are none.
Then I have some questions to start the conversation. Paula, you told us about COVID. So police work changed during COVID. Can you tell us a bit more about your research during COVID?
Yeah, definitely. So we wanted to really get in very quickly with understanding how first responders, who of course are continuing to operate during this time, already knowing that they're very stressed and experiencing significant mental health disorders and such, that COVID is definitely going to be making this situation worse for them. So we've launched a survey for not only police officers, but we're also interested in looking at paramedics who as well are attending for medical emergencies, as well as dispatchers. So these are the people when you call 911 or whatever number it is in your countries that answer, and have also been shown to have very significant psychosocial disorders as a result of these traumatic impact of their work, kind of hearing people in distress and the helplessness, not being able to respond and not knowing what happens either when they pass the call along. So we're starting to build some fast evidence, and here in Canada, where it's been over a year now of the state of emergency and at various stages of emergency and lockdown and procedure, that we also wanted to understand that as you go from kind of red to orange to yellow to kind of less state of emergency, what we're starting to see actually is that as the emergency increases, that depression and anxiety symptoms tend to increase as well. So there's kind of like a linear pattern that I would assume as a non-first responder myself, I can understand that as well, that there's so much more concern for going out and things like that. So we're really looking forward to kind of sharing these results. And I see questions coming up in the
Yeah,
chat.
I wanted to say that they're like now flowing, Peter.
Yeah, and that's great. I welcome other people to talk.
Let's start with the
others.
first one. That's great. Okay, so the first point is I was wondering what advice you would give to someone starting in this field. I'm going to be starting a doctoral program in the fall and hope to focus in on this particular topic. And then they add, I also have found some research in conducting my master's thesis that exposure to critical incidents didn't always correspond with PTSI, and in some cases, the daily stressors seemed to be a greater impact. Can you please speak a little about that, how you go about researching this factor? Thoughts, panelists?
Yeah, so if I can jump in a little bit with that. Congratulations on being so brave to undertake a doctoral program, period. You have to be very resilient to do it, no matter what, biology, neuroscience, applied policing, whatever it is, so good for you. And that's a very good point too, that it's not sometimes these big exposures that will, result in the greatest trauma, but they're everyday chronic little stressors that individuals might feel. And how we've kind of separated them in the field is to understand operational stressors. So that's related to your day-to-day duties. So the stress and uncertainty of going to different calls, not knowing what to expect. But there are also organizational stressors. So things related to being in the workplace. So maybe there are tensions between the leadership and the frontline guys, or among a team of people. Especially women in the field may also feel like an underrepresented group, and you're in a very masculine dominated environment. So some of these operational versus organizational stressors that together fall under occupational stress, a lot of O's, are some of the factors that you might be looking into. But I welcome, Annika has her hand too, definitely.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a very difficult topic in a way, but on the other hand, what we found was that, well, people often talk about how can it be that people who experience exactly the same situation, they either develop PTSD, for instance, or they do not. But when we went into the details of the experience, you always see that they're never the same. So people do not experience the same situations. And I think it's a lot to do with what the function that I was talking about in homeostasis, but what the purpose of the person involved really was. If the intention was to, for instance, get there at the scene very soon, as fast as they could, in order to help someone and, for instance, rescue them, and they didn't succeed in rescuing them, even though other people were there at the scene in order to do something completely different. For instance, they had to tell the horrific story to the parents or something else. It might seem that they had experienced the same situation, but they do not. So what you first need to do is get to how they were integrated within the context. So what were they trying to achieve? And did they manage to achieve this? This is really pivotal. And it's not so much about the factors that were all there present at the scene. It's also about how people try to achieve something and they do or they don't achieve. So try to have a look at what they were aiming at, which is very, very important in the context.
Thank you. And then we have a question about in terms of gathering data on resilience. Can you see it? Can I please ask what the challenges are? Yeah, this is really good information. So challenges are where people may cope better than others in terms of survey development.
So I'm wondering, Becky, you maybe can kind of clarify. So is that might have been something that I touched on in my talk too. That it is difficult to.
What I'm wondering too, but I wanted to bring it back up just because the comment was in the chat.
For sure, no, definitely.
Yeah, Becky, would you like more? Do you need more information? Do you have thoughts? I don't know if you can unmute. See if I. Oh, I'm allowing Becky to talk. Go ahead, Becky, do you want to elaborate? Thank you.
Sorry for the question. I'm just starting to, I'm just doing a master's in research, so I'm interested in how you would, in terms of developing the survey, what the challenges are to get that, to elicit that information from participants, because it's quite, I imagine it's quite difficult when you're trying to ascertain, you know, so like somebody may cope very well at home, but they may not cope at work. There may be situations that trigger them. So I think what I'm wondering is, how do you sensitively address that in a survey, but still get the data that you need? And how challenging is that? Because surveys can be, well, they are just quite objective documents. So that was, sorry, I didn't word it very well in the chat box.
No, that's okay. But a great, great question, and very, very valid. And as I mentioned too, it's hard to quantify these things, and relying on someone's self-report, and then policing where there's a culture to kind of under-report weaknesses and vulnerabilities and these types of things. It is really important to kind of either gain trust through some research partnerships, so that, excuse me, so that your participants can really be open and honest in you know, doing these large reviews of comparing studies. I would really recommend trying to look at validated, standardized measures of coping. So these mean that, you know, scientists have asked these of thousands of people and the same people over multiple periods of time, so that their answers are consistent over time. And the questions are quite standard. They tend not to be too triggering. I know we've had some trouble on our end getting approval for questions that probe anything related to suicidality, and whether a person might, you know, be feeling so bad that they might want to harm themselves, which is a very real and important issue, especially here in Canada and North America. Understanding suicide among police is a large issue. But I definitely understand your viewpoint, and there are different aspects. Like the survey we asked for COVID was just two very basic questions. How has COVID impacted your work? And how has COVID impacted your life? And just a free form box, people can answer in as much or little detail as they want. And we have lots of really great information that, again, very specific to their work, like having to respond to a COVID patient and then immediately to a mother who was immunosuppressed and her young baby, and the fear of, am I now transmitting this virus through my work? So kind of a combination, I would say, of the standardized measures. Those are safe and comparable to other studies, but also kind of developing straightforward questions that are really going to answer what you are interested in probing.
Thank you.
Other comments, perhaps?
I would
Thank
like to add just a few words. I agree with Paula with using the standardized or validated instruments, and at the same time be very specific about what you want to know. I think that's a good combination. What we tried to do was develop a resilience monitor within the Dutch police force, and we tailor-made it for different function groups within the police. And it's a 200-item questionnaire. So it's a lot. And you can't always give this to people and expect them to really answer it. So it's very difficult. It's very difficult to measure resilience in the broad sense of the word. So I agree with Paula that if you have a specific idea of what you'd really like to know, then be as specific as you can. And sometimes surveys not really. I learned more about qualitative studies on how the context really is important than surveys. But yeah, it depends on what you really need to know.
Annika, maybe you can tell us more about your methods you're using in your research. So I see a question about qualitative research.
Yeah, we use all types of different research, qualitative research and quantitative, and as broad and deep as ethnographic studies, and as quantitative as brain potentials, and everything in between. So it really depends on what you would like to know. And what we did was try to get a sense of what it is that people are really doing within their context. And we really needed to have a look at different types of jobs within the police force in order to understand what we needed to know about the context. So sometimes you just have to study and monitor a group for a longer period in time. And what we did was did some physiological studies, and those were very quantitative. And we did some psychological studies, and we used some psychometrics as well, but we studied them close by. And we did some moral sensitivity studies about the opening of people and trying the empathy of people. And that really needed us to go into depth of the police work. And these were monitoring studies that could really go on for more than a year, and then try to understand what these people were actually doing in order to perform successfully. So we had a whole battery of different types of methods.
Utilizing different types of qualitative methods really does yield information beyond what quantitative might bring forth. I agree 100%, Annika. All of my research has been community-based participatory research, which is can be more qualitative than quantitative based, but that sense of observation sometimes is important, and I'm sure you've experienced that as well, in gaining and understanding more of what's going on, for example, within any type of organization, and then looking at methods that you might utilize to move forward. Yeah, I have to say, I agree.
Marcia, I see some questions in the Q&A.
So how do you address or handle police departments wanting to use your research to identify police officers who may be fit for duty if they do? And I believe that's our last question, Peter.
That's a very sensitive question.
Yeah, I was going to say that's a really tough one.
Yeah. How do you approach that, Paula?
Ooh, we don't. We walk away. No. That's a really tough question because our research answers one very specific question, right? We collect very specific measures and observing very specific behaviors, but those behaviors that we tend to observe. So I also work with Dr. Judith Anderson. So Greg Anderson and Anderson, not confusing at all. So here at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, and we look at stress and resilience as well as lethal force decision making and how stress physiology affects that. And we observe police officers during their annual fit for duty requalification, whether they make shooting errors or not. And by and large, the officers, they pass their qualification, but that's not part of their research. We're just examining their heart rate, the extent of stress physiology. Does that impact whether they make errors or not? But a large issue here, especially once again, Canada and North American focus is racial bias and implicit racial bias. And how does that impact policing? And there was a recommendation in an inquest saying that all police officers should be screened with this implicit association task, this computer-based task, to screen them for racism, new and existing police officers, and if they're racist, they should not be hired. But there are a lot of problems with this task. There are Black individuals that take this test and it tells them that they are racist against Black people. So we've kind of, called to question really looking at and evaluating certain measures and recommendations like this that have very significant professional implications for individuals, whether they're fit for duty or not, but do they actually translate to behavior? And we're trying to get this paper published, and hopefully it will be soon. And you can find it on ResearchGate. I post all of my publications there very quickly. And we found that even though officers did this task and shows that most of them have an anti-Black bias, that in the shooting task that we had that had either a Black actor or a white actor, and everything else in the video was exactly the same. They were even wearing the same clothes with the same build. And the only difference was the race of the individual, is that there was small errors, slightly more errors towards the Black suspects, but not statistically significant, and not what would be suggested either by the racial bias test or by the population data that does show a large disparity in Canada as well as the United States. So these are important questions that we want to probe with research and we try wherever we can to make recommendations for policy and training improvements, but determining fitness for duty, like that is such an important qualification that our research that answers one little question can't really speak to that. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think in a broad sense, we have the same situation in the Netherlands. We do the scientific research, but we do not pinpoint persons per se. So we do not use our scientific research for the police departments in order to answer these types of questions. What we do have is psychologists and physicians who work together with police leaders in order to sharpen their look and see how what perspective they have on the different people within their unit. But we as researchers do not pinpoint vulnerable or resilient people. We never do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you for your responses. Unfortunately, we're out of time, Peter. And so we appreciate the time and energy that everyone's put into this presentation, and you can find information about the panelists on the conference website, and look forward to seeing everyone in other sessions. Thank you very much. Peter, is there anything you want to add in closing?
No, thank you. Yeah, our contact details are on the website, so feel free to contact us. Thank you.
All right, take care. Bye.